We're going to talk about landscape infrastructure. Um, and so this is just to put a background onto this topic is, on the one hand, I'm talking about projects in relationship to landscape and infrastructure. But in actual fact, it's important to kind of plot it in a sort of historical context, because a lot of it relates to the way that that landscape architecture has developed in the last 15, 20 years. And a lot of that is to do with the idea of infrastructure and its relationship to landscape as a metaphor, because a lot of the time, in a way, landscape fights against the fact that it's either decorative or non-essential or recreational or intellectual, and it doesn't have the immediate sort of sense of itself that architecture has. So it's got this sort of panic at its base, and I think that comes from its history. Because, for example, if we think about what landscape architecture was right up until probably the middle of the 19th century, it was really based around wealthy gardens. And it was, if you think about the landscapes of the picturesque English landscapes, it was highly theoretical. It was highly based around issues of taste and sculpture, and so in a way, landscape gained its identity a lot as a profession because of the work of Olmsted and those urbanists from the French Haussmann period, who also then exported that idea of the relationship between the park and the city to a lot of colonial countries, whether it be Buenos Aires or the US, etc. And so with that, in a way, in the 20th century, when modernism started to arise, the role of landscape was established as somewhere between sort of health and sort of otherness. And so the idea of the kind of landscape as the machine, or the garden as a machine, came up. But part of that is really, again, playing because of this anxiety around the role of landscape. And so I see the rise of landscape and infrastructure, and I use that term in a lot of different ways, which we'll talk about today, as partly being a desire to instrumentalize the landscape. And when I use instrumentalize, what I mean by that is to treat the landscape as an instrument, as something that has an effect, and has is sort of much more significant than any sort of recreational role. And so during this sort of last 20 years, as for instance, when climate change has arisen as an issue and landscapes gained a large role in relationship to climate change mitigation, whether that's sea level rise or whether that's issues around carbon sequestration or anything like that. And so in that sense, the landscape is seen as an infrastructure because it's also recognised as the kind of foundation upon which all other propositions exist. And so the term infrastructure is sort of become synonymous with landscapes and talking about landscapes as infrastructure. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to plot a few ways through those terms to sort of give you a sense of how it's developed. And so I've kind of got a little typology here. One of those, and they sort of break up into an aesthetic of infrastructure, landscaping infrastructure, occupying infrastructure, working infrastructurally, landscape thinking for infrastructure, and green infrastructure. So these are the types that I'm going to talk about. And probably one of the first ones and most important ones that we can talk about is this project by Alexander Chemetov at the Parc de la Villette in Paris from 1986. And we've talked about Chemetov before. What have we said about Chemetov during this semester to date? Anyone remember? It was from last week, in fact.
Project.
Ile de Nantes. Yeah. So his project for Ile de Nantes was a major kind of post-industrial rehabilitation effort. And Chemetov has been probably one of the most important landscape architects to come out of the Versailles School, and this is one of the earliest projects. And so I've said that an aesthetic of infrastructure is designing landscapes that have the appearance of infrastructure, either through the inclusion of engineering elements or materials. Now, this is an important crux, and it's a crux in terms of modernism, because essentially during modernism, there was some sense of a relationship between the aesthetic of something and its program. And so form follows function is the most common sort of adage, which is Louis Sullivan's term, pre-modern actually. And the idea that the look of something had a relationship to what it does. And so if we think about, and that seems obvious now, but as I think we mentioned before, in the prior to the 20th century, when the orders were prevalent in architecture, buildings didn't look like what they were used for. They looked around. They developed their form from symbolic representation, such as ionic columns associated with X land use, etc. And so an aesthetic of infrastructure is something that also you have to see in relationship to modernism and architecture. And so if we think about the fact that this project was from 1986, and we think about projects by people like James Stirling, we think about projects by Grimshaw in architecture. We think about Norman Foster. There was this thing that's actually was known as kind of, at the time, was known as kind of techno, which was architecture that was really based around expressing of junction. So it's a return of a high modern architecture. And so landscape picked up on that as well. And I think this comes to this question of, if it doesn't look like infrastructure, is it infrastructure? And so this project was important. If you remember the generative things about the Parc La Villette were these sort of lines, points, and this sort of cinematographic strip that runs through it. The diagram of the park had this sort of whirling cinematographic strip that goes around, that's intersected by circulation systems. And so, for example, here is where a longer line crosses this thing, and this lower space here is one of these elements that is sort of in this lower cinematographic strip. And if we look at it, what's interesting about it, I suppose, is that it's quite a kind of polemical. And there we can see one of the follies, the red follies, that is one of these points. And so it's quite polemical insofar as by recessing itself down, it is ostensibly trying to demonstrate that the ground is not as certain as we think. And so if we zoom in here, you can see that here is where a major site pipe runs through the site. And you can also see that the whole language of pipes and kind of this of these pipes, etc. So on the one hand, it's something like a kind of Renaissance fountain. I mean, this wall could have been, the fountain of the 100 fountains at Villette, but so it's playing with that, but at the same time, it's sort of revealing this section. And so the idea that landscape is more than it seems, that it's the sort of receptacle of services, and that the ground is not just naturalistic, is a really important idea to this sort of sense of landscape and infrastructure. So this, in a way, as much as there is one large pipe going through this site, the rest of this is actually ornamental. So it's an aesthetic of function, an aesthetic of infrastructure. So, of course, there's another analogy here. And so who'd like to suggest what the relationship between the bamboo is and this sense of infrastructure? I mean, it's pipe-like. It's also, in a way, it's sort of like totally consistent as a material. It's one of the most vigorous plants you can kind of get. So it's its whole aesthetic and the sense of what it is, and the plant's pumping. It's all part of the whole language of the project. And so, other parts of the project are for instance, when you cross the bamboo garden, you can see here we have the sort of checker plate, we have the gridding, and so all of this sort of industrial language deployed into the landscape as part of this infrastructural proposition. Probably one of the most interesting things about the project, which is not often discussed, is a sound sculpture that is at one end. And you can see here these elements. What they do is they catch and broadcast sounds from other parts of this space. And so they kind of distort the acoustic properties of that space. And so in a sense, above here we have trees, we have park and all of those things. And in a way it's a bit like it's a sort of maybe a go at Schumi to sort of to suggest that landscape is more than it seems. And so I call it the aesthetic of infrastructure because you have to ask this question, like infrastructure, to what extent can we call it infrastructure? Now, the second type is I call landscaping for infrastructure, or landscaping infrastructure, which is to say, while the first one is deploying the aesthetics of infrastructure, the second one is essentially about providing a landscape context, a physical landscape for infrastructure. And so the important thing to recognise about this approach is that it really focuses around the idea that infrastructure has impacts. And this is probably, in absolute terms, that's the biggest thing about infrastructure. The terms of reference of infrastructure are big and they're beyond the ornamental, and they are, they have significant impacts. And whereas during if we think about the foreshore now, the roads at the foreshore, and you think about the time when it was built, I think a lot of you guys went to that presentations the other week about the foreshore project. Some of you did, I know. And it's quite an interesting thing to think that when that was proposed, the idea of having a huge flying freeway that separated off the city from the water, the sense of that as a freeway and as a piece of engineering was part of the aesthetic of the time. And so people weren't thinking about it as an impact. They were only thinking about it as a positive demonstration of technological progress. And the fact that we see it as an impact now tells you that there's been a change. And that change has been related to a kind of largely a community backlash against sort of this technocratic top-down governance processes, which is to say that a strategic idea can have major impacts at a local level. And so, for instance, grassroots organisations, NIMBY, etc., infrastructure is one of those things that they're always going to get into contact with. And so landscape has had a role largely through something known as mitigation. And mitigation is obviously about mitigating the impacts. But one of the major aspects of that has been the increasing negative association with infrastructure. And so these projects actually are representing a different take. And that's representing the idea that the experience from the car is really important. Now, ironically, this is still part of the modern tradition in a sense, because people like Kevin Lynch and Donald Appleyard wrote a book called The View from the Road. There's been so did Christopher Tunnard wrote a book called The Man-Made Landscape. There's a lot of books about the idea that the changing mobility from the car and the changing sense of viewpoint from the car means that landscape is perceived in a very different way to how it has been before. And so roads, the experience of the driver suddenly had become important. And so both these projects ultimately are about the experience of the driver. And the first one is from Westgate. We talked about Westgate, I think. We talked about them last week. I know we talked about them in the week on the Netherlands. And it's an old project, but it's a kind of interesting project. And we looked, I think, at how these large kind of dikes and systems were working. And here, what we've got here these are actually storm barriers. And so obviously with one of the issues around climate change is that as we get sea level rise and it interacts with changed larger meteorological systems such as storms, it's creating storms and stuff that we don't really know about entirely. And then with things like king tides, the potential for storm surge is massive. And Oosterschelde is like one of these storm barriers. And so, as you can see, it's a series of of barriers and artificial islands that create other recreational facilities along the way, as well as sort of protective facilities. And so West State's strategy of this road, characteristic of the period, they created this sort of landscape which was really just a series of piles of shells. And so those piles of shells were in these sort of chevron strips. So again, playing around with the chevron and line marking at a much larger scale. And also, they had a rather sort of, this is also, if you've looked at from last year in history, landscape history, the work of the people at the Decorative Arts Festival in Paris in 1913, people like Paul Vera. And so this is really that sort of landscape approach. But one of their things, which was probably the weirdest thing about this project, was the idea that they noticed that the birds that nested in this area, the white birds nested on the white strips, and the black birds nested on the black strips. And the idea was that as you drove through, all the birds would kind of like lift off, and you would be in this sort of moving landscape. And as you can imagine, that lasted about 10 minutes, and then, this has all grown over. But I think what's important about this project in retrospect is that it's one of the earliest projects in landscape architecture that treated the landscape as, in a way, the intervention of the landscape as at this territorial scale. And so we have to think about territory when we think about infrastructure, because that's the scale at which infrastructure operates. And attempts at sort of producing landscape around that are about negotiating between the territorial scale, where it's about the effects, and at the vehicle scale, where it's about experience. And so those two dynamics are the dynamics that play out in infrastructure. This project here is one from Taylor Cullity Lefleen in Melbourne. This is a drawing of my friend Scott Adams, who's one of the directors there. His project, interestingly, when we were studying together, he and I and another friend used to have a first practice. He and I started for a couple of years, and interestingly, his dissertation project was about designing. He was a caver, and so his project was actually about designing the interior of freeway tunnels as caves and modelling them as caves. And so he always had an interest in infrastructure. So there's a road between Sydney and Melbourne. It's actually called Sydney Road, and that road is interesting because it's become really congested. But it was traditionally the way into Melbourne, and so they had to bypass it. But they wanted to think about the transition between the city centre, and the sort of landscape. And so the landscape around as one enters into Melbourne is this sort of, it's this basalt plain, and so scoria rocks and eucalypts and it's full of this sort of grassland around it. And so the idea was to really play with the transition between a sense of being in the landscape and a sense of entering the city. And so in the first instance, and I think that's something you start to see in Scott's drawing here, is that he's sort of playing around and modulating with the relationship between the road and this sort of rock landscape and the city. And the interesting thing about it is, in a way, I haven't photographed the parts that, or I don't have photographs of the parts that are most interesting to me, but having worked on a lot of road projects myself, and infrastructure has been my main experience professionally, is that there are so many players in infrastructure. There's so many people who have a say because of what's going on. There's noise consultants, there's macroeconomics, microeconomics, archaeology. There's so much stuff going on that once it's actually it's very hard to keep a road in a landscape. It's really easy to keep a road at the bottom of an embankment because the inherent idea is you have to screen the road. Roads are ugly. Roads create impacts. They're negative. And the safety measures associated with roads are so. If you think about any of the roads in town here, and we're lucky because if you go along Philip Kogasama, you can see that there's actually you're lucky because you can see the mountain. But if you now put yourself in the middle of the stretch between the N2 and the M5 there, it's like you're in a trough, and that's very much the way that roads are tended to work. Whereas in this situation, what they did was they were able to work with the engineers. So they removed all the fencing, they removed all the lighting, they removed virtually all of the safety measures. Not in this stretch you're looking at, in the earlier stretch. So it literally felt like you were driving through, even though you were on an 8-lane freeway, it felt like you were driving directly through this landscape on a country road. It was quite amazing that they did that. And that was by them having to, as landscape architects, ultimately they were the lead contractor, and so the road people were actually working for them. And so as you move out of this landscape, you get to this point of transition, which is this point here, and that's a sculpture by an artist that was part of the team. And the idea was that from one side it's a pedestrian bridge. Fundamentally, it's a pedestrian and bike bridge to get people across, but at the same time, it also provides this kind of transition point where you move off that plane into this landscape where you can see the city profile behind. So it acts like an articulation of the threshold between the two. And at the same time, there's a kind of a thing where this sort of graphic here, there's in the Australian sort of mythology, there's this guy called Ned Kelly. And Ned Kelly was what we'd call a bushranger in Australia, which is like a bandit. It's a highwayman. And Australia had, a lot of Irish convicts, etc. And so, the Kelly brothers were these sort of bandits, and he got a metal bucket, and he cut a hole in it for his eyes, and then he got a whole lot of plowshares, and he made a metallic sort of suit for himself so that he could rob anybody, and all of the gun shots didn't hit him. And so there's always, people will often try to sneak this sort of thing here as the kind of eye slot through which, and so that's just a little in-joke, and Melbourne is all about these kind of in-jokes. And so as you then move past that corner and you move into this other landscape, and then in this landscape there are a series of these vertical blades, and they rotate around their axis and angle to allow for a sort of a sense of rhythm moving into the city, until finally, as you move into the city itself, you then move into what they call this sort of scrim wall, which is all these LEDs that are calibrated to the movement of cars, so that as you drive, it's sort of like a colour is following you as you drive into the city. And so you can see they're moving between a series of different interpretations into the landscape. This project was really significant in Australia because they put the bid together with the main contractor for the roads contractor, and as the coordinators of that bid, they were able to have a sort of landscape approach for all of the other projects. And ultimately the project came in on time, under budget, and it was entirely run by a landscape architect, even though those features were very cheap in comparison to the overall. This is a tendency that you see more and more, particularly in Australia, but all around the place, which is the sort of idea of landscape as a curatorial practice. Landscape as a practice that has its overview in the landscape and manages all of those things that are in the landscape and has an overview of them even while it doesn't necessarily do something to them. And so, most of the deans now in the design schools in Australia, for example, are landscape architects with all of the other disciplines that they're supervising. And I think that relates to this curatorial kind of view. The next type I'm going to talk about is this type I'm calling occupying infrastructure. And so occupying infrastructure refers to the idea that infrastructure is impactful and takes up space. And so the reason we could say this, and probably the most obvious way to say it, is that if you think about the amount of space taken up by traffic interchanges, and it's not just the amount of space that they literally take up, it's the way that they take up space. I mean, everyone is rightfully upset about expropriation without compensation, but expropriation has been a part of infrastructure practice for a long time all over the world, and nobody ever gets good money for their properties that are bought due to expropriation. And expropriation is something that a government has to have the ability to do, because if the government doesn't have the ability to expropriate, they don't have the ability to do things that are greater than any individual's needs or rights. And so, for example, if you create a piece of infrastructure, you may have to compulsorily acquire properties to do so. You might have to excise square metres off people's properties. You might have to do a whole range of things. And so the shape of infrastructure is quite interesting, I always find, because what you're seeing is not just the shape, the size of the infrastructure itself, you're seeing the sphere of influence and the shape of the properties it had to purchase. So often you'll see the shape of the infrastructure reserve will jump out a little bit or cut across here, and all of that is about the fact that the infrastructure is crossing property boundaries, and those property boundaries have to be dealt with in some way and acquired. And so with that in mind, infrastructure actually produces a lot of space, unusable space. I've got a student at the moment who's in the Urban Infrastructure Design and Management Masters at Civil, and I'm supervising his dissertation on informal infrastructure. And he's a traffic engineer, and we're looking at ways that the N2 can be redesigned and reconfigured in terms of safety and in terms of road design parameters to allow for it to be utilised by the range of people who do utilise it. Because the current approach is to say, well, just keep fencing it, and we'll keep fencing it, and eventually we'll stop people using it, we'll stop cattle being on it, we'll stop goats being on it, we'll stop people playing golf on it, we'll stop all the range of things that happen. But the other thing you could say is, in a place where space, where occupation, where ownership of space and public open space is sort of contentious, that's a lot of engagement. And so if you can think about ways of engaging and utilising the leftover spaces of infrastructure, that's got some value. So this project is, again, it's like in the same way that on the first page here, this one by Shemetov is a kind of iconic infrastructure project, landscape infrastructure project. This one is too, which is by Batlle and Roig from Barcelona. It's Parc Trinitat. And I think probably one of the key issues here was that, this project is again from the 80s. So it's from the period that we talked about in the Barcelona lecture. And it also represents an idea, one of the first points where designers were involved in infrastructure design other than engineers. And so this one also is a kind of like, if you can see from this picture at the top here, you can see a kind of a sense that the designers were looking at how the various systems of infrastructure around the range of different roads that were being interrupted by this new infrastructure, and they were beginning to explore the geometry that was arising from the emerging infrastructure that was being produced. And they developed this sort of park design that is inside a traffic roundabout. And it's both a park and it's also a sports centre and a swimming pool, and it's got a lot of those things that we would recognise from the time in terms of this idea of multifunction, etc. And so if one sort of accesses it, you kind of have to find your way into it via this sort of negotiate your way through this sort of roundabout and into the site. And so, and then, here is the example of, I've got a better one here of how you enter it. Where is it? Yeah, you kind of, this is the part of the thing, and I always take photos of these things is because the way that infrastructure and pedestrian circulation works is that most of the time infrastructure creates underpasses. And underpasses are by far the nastiest, most, as we all know from our experience, the most anxiety-causing things. And so on the one hand, they seem to be maintaining pedestrian access, but the pedestrian access that they are maintaining is kind of terrifying or whatever. And so the idea of trying to sort of disappear the road and play with the transition into the space, or disappear all of the infrastructure to the point where you have a transition like this with light, etc., is a really important part of, or really interesting sort of innovation in this project. So you kind of enter Parc Trinitat through this sort of underpasses that cut their way through, that are also acting as gates into the park. And then the park itself sort of remembers the previous agricultural land uses of the site. And so it's got olive trees, it's got this sort of poplars and a whole range of other species there. So it's got this sort of hill, which is a sort of agricultural landscape in the centre, which is a kind of reinstatement of what was originally there. And in the way that was sort of characteristic of the period, if you look at this here, there's some quite beautiful transitions between how slopes meet paths and banks, etc. And so there's, you know, the characteristic sort of Barcelona care for those kind of things. On the top here, a lot of the top at this point, we have tennis courts, ball courts, etc. This is the point where everyone asks me is, why don't your pictures ever have pictures of people in them? But you know, because I'm always visiting them at weird times. Another project which is interesting in terms of this sort of idea of occupying infrastructure is this project in Groningen by KCAP, or Kees Christian Architects. And so it's a forecourt for the station in Groningen, and that station, Groningen is a really interesting city for design, because they had a kind of like a sort of architecture expo thing in the 90s, and they've continued to do these things. So the whole city is full of kind of weird postmodern design detritus. And this project is doing something which I think is quite interesting. It's maintaining views to the historic railway station, and then it's got the ground plane, and it's sort of like treating it like these two wings. And so you kind of enter across here, and then the two wings of this surface, as you can see here, they kind of kick up at either end. And so on the one hand, it's like a ground, and if we think of figured ground terms, it's like an artificial ground plane. It's got these kind of light well penetrations through, etc. And then underneath, it's an enormous, bike parking lot under there. So it's quite crazy to think that this many people are actually riding and catching a train, but that's the way the place rolls. And so on top of it, we'll see also this sort of, there's elements that are about remembering certain things of history, etc. I'm going to finish this lecture really early today. Is that going to kill you guys? No. And so the next type, so that's occupying infrastructure, which is to say that infrastructure creates space, unwanted space. How do we utilize that? Whether it be capping it and working on top of it, whether it be working on the spaces inside it. And the next one, the next few are kind of things that I would say working infrastructurally. And working infrastructurally is probably these days probably one of the most important things we do. And so, because if you think about the other options, or the other ones I've been talking about, an aesthetic of infrastructure is about the look of infrastructure. Landscaping infrastructure is about providing amenity to an infrastructure which is already existing or already existing. Occupying infrastructure is working within the space it created, whereas working infrastructurally is recognizing that infrastructure first and foremost is a way of practicing. And I think that's probably the main idea we have, and I'm being very literal in my examples of this, but working infrastructurally would be, and I think this is the thing to remember about infrastructure, which I've already said before, is infrastructure ultimately is about what it does. No one builds a piece of infrastructure because it looks good. They build it because of what it does. At the same time, the reason why we get a piece of infrastructure at the foreshore is also that there is a celebration of infrastructure at that time. Working infrastructurally is recognizing that what you do in your design is you catalyze effects. You influence things. When people say, map this or understand the relationship of the project to the territory, what they're trying to do is to get you to understand how your project could be catalytic within a bigger framework. If you understand why it's a kind of key moment, then maybe if you design it, you can affect what's happening around it by keying into what the other dynamics, urban dynamics around the site. And so part of that is working infrastructurally, recognising what those forces need. Now, these are really both failed examples of being literal about that question, but I always think failed examples are really interesting as well. Another project here by Westgate from 1995, and this one is interesting, I think, because the project is a square that is totally empty, and so the square is has no trees or has no sort of even seats necessarily, but what it does is it's got a combination of obstructions and I would call like facilitators. And so like a key example of an obstruction is, if you look at these two here, this opening this panel of steel up allows for this rail to drop into the ground. And so the whole site is crisscrossed with these barriers that are hidden. So what you can do is, as you pop them up, you can affect the movement of that through the surface of cars and people. And so you can reconfigure activity to cause figure. So in other words, rather than saying I'm designing a figure or a shape, you can say I'm creating effects that will make people the figure, will make the movement of people the shape of the landscape. This reminds us of who that we were talking about a couple of weeks ago in relationship to figured ground. Yes. Yeah. Lawrence Halprin. You know, so that idea of landscape as an activator of movement, of the shape of landscape being the shape of movement, is really important. At the same time also, you know, they had these, you know, these sort of things to attach the market spaces to. But as usual, what I find interesting is, like, this is a sort of highly speculative thing. People do use it. But then you go and you see stuff like this, which is, where is it? I'll show you. I love this. Somebody has basically like, no, this is not in the right place. I'll just get a piece of steel and I'll whack it in a crack between the pavers and to do that. Like, and I think that tells you something. It's a really important lesson of the module. And so since modernism, the idea has always been around that if we can find the right module, we can probably solve everything. And so modularity and searching for the module has become like, you know, when people will start to, you know, like when I first arrived, this friend of mine, James, you guys know James Duplessis, but he was working for Heinrich Wolff, and he said to me, you know, I was saying, oh yeah, you know, there's so much, you know, it's like, it's in, maybe there's stuff you can do with you know, things that are thrown away in South Africa. And he was like, James said to me, Jules, you know, every bastard is trying to do something with plastic bottles here. Just give it up. Like, everyone is trying to find a solution out of an everyday item that can be massed up, recombined to fix everything. And if it was going to have happened, it probably would have happened already. And so I think the module is we should be very suspicious of the module, because as much as every time we put in a system like this, we think we're giving people choice, but in effect we're limiting their choice. So every time you specify a location, you're de-specifying another location. Which is not to say that this strategy doesn't interest me. I mean, I didn't get there on a day, well, I've been there a couple of times, but I didn't get there on days when it was not working, to see what the space was like on its own. Another project that happened again, this project was ripped out, was a market space there's a firm called Oculus, who are also one of kind of the most interesting practices in Australia. And this was a sort of like a terracing down a slope where these were kind of market stalls for boot fairs. Do they call them boot fairs here? Like people selling items out of the boot of their car? Boot sales, yeah. 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 And so people would basically be able to sort of, you know, this divides up the lots, people in here, and then they have this sort of places for electricity and water. And so these walls are really providers of infrastructure and services for the people who are on the malls, and so on these surfaces of the terraces. So in a way, when the market's not on, it's a piece of landscape that is quite beautifully graded, and when it is on, its infrastructure operations are revealed. Interesting. I was talking to is there such a thing as an uncle-in-law? I don't know, but he was the ex-mayor of George, and he was telling me that when he was was working in George, he was trying to get the approach to RDP housing to change. He said, each RDP house was costing about $190,000 serviced, and he was saying, but if we just give people lots and service them, then they can actually upgrade and have more role in developing what they need, and the lots are serviced with all of the services provided, and you can give 20 people serviced lots rather than giving 5 people, whatever, 2 people, whatever. So this idea of providing the infrastructure that lets something emerge is a really fundamental idea to the idea of landscape and infrastructure. So infrastructure as a catalyst. I haven't got a slide in here, but this is where also a number of things that, in terms of the discourse around landscape and infrastructure, have also been around the types of landscapes that are produced by infrastructure. And so there's a guy called Pierre Belanger, who's from Harvard, who's been researching the landscape that is produced by oil extraction, the landscape that is produced by military operations. And so these ones would talk about these as infrastructural landscapes as compared to designed landscapes. Landscape thinking for infrastructure provision. This is an example of the kind of work that I was working on, and here's a kind of clear example of mitigation. These are old projects because, as I've said before, infrastructure projects, they take a long time. And so this Melbourne Airport rail link, which I worked on for 2.5 years in 2000, is only now about to begin. The consultants have just been approved for the emerging project. And what's that? That's almost 20 years later. Roads that I worked on at that time as well have only been built in the last 2 years. Are there things from my design in there? Kind of, maybe, roughly. And so you have to see that the role is huge. And landscape, the hard part about it is that this type of work, which might be a combination of impact assessment, it's largely impact assessment, mitigation measures, etc., is actually, for landscape architects, the bread and butter of landscape architecture, because it's where the best fees come from, because it often ends up in court. And because it ends up in court, once it's in that process, it's really has to be its methodologies have to be really carefully moderated. And one of the reasons why I'm so interested in trying to develop students' writing abilities is that a lot of landscape practice is report writing. And so the ability to write reports is actually quite fundamental to the ability to practice, and particularly the ability to get a decent wage. In an office, someone will stay working on CAD if they can't write. So writing is really important. And so this project was for a railway between the airport and the city centre in Melbourne. And what we were doing was we were the lead consultant, where we were evaluating 3 routes. And so the engineers and the quantity surveyors had gone through and determined that there were 3 potential routes that utilised bits of existing rolling stock, etc. And those 3 routes, what we had to do was we had to use a whole lot of consultants to try to develop their idea about the pros and cons of those routes. And those routes, there were actually 3 routes, and there were 3 types of operations. So 24 hours a day, PM, AM for each of those routes. And so when you started to, I don't think I'm going to have the res in here to do it, but let's have a look. Oh yeah. And so, when you start to look at all of the kind of issues that arise in these sort of, in landscape terms, this is only one section of it, but there are so so many different types of information that have to be brought together. And ultimately, when you make a recommendation like this about what's the best corridor, what you're really looking at is you're talking about something which is going to have a massive impact. And so there's none of the options don't have an impact. Each of the options may have a different impact. And that impact is something that's going to be felt on people's real estate values. It's potentially going to be something that's felt on their, when they wake up in the morning, their neurotic dog, like all sorts of stuff. And I mean, we used to have to do these things where we would go from, you're talking about a piece of road that's probably 30 Ks, or a piece of rail that's 30 Ks, and we would have to walk that, and we would have to go to every single property that's along that alignment, and we would have to document a photo of what it was going to look like when it was there. We'd have to find out what was happening on that site. We had to develop massive databases to be able to store that information, because ultimately we had to be able to present things like 275 properties will be partially affected, 27 will be majorly affected, etc., etc. Then we had to cross-reference socioeconomic. This one is going to affect 10 wealthy people and 60 poor people. And guess, the one that was actually the thing that shut down the whole thing were the 10 rich people, because all of the rest of the other ones, the potential economic benefits were massive. So this is the thing about infrastructure. There's one corridor that was called the Footscray corridor, and if that railway had gone through that part, that suburb, that train line would have got 2 new railway stations. That would have opened up a whole lot of affordable housing for the city, but the cost of it was a bit higher, so the government wanted to put it on the one that was a little bit cheaper, which had these 10 wealthy people who shut the whole project down, and so the whole thing died. And so these are the kind of things. And, when you think about, you're looking at a landscape and you're trying to work out, what it is, you have to talk about things like, benefits, disbenefits, all of these types of options, and you have to translate something from a kind of an aesthetic sense, as well as you have to merge aesthetic information, ownership information, and then try to represent it to people who just read. They don't know how to read a drawing. If you want to try to argue for why something should be better aesthetically, you can't. So you have to find another rationale and try to argue that one, and hide the fact that the reason you're doing it is it's going to look better. And ultimately, we ended up in court for weeks over this. Every day, expert witnessing. Hundreds of dollars an hour. So our consultant fees in Australia at that time for this project were 2 million Australian dollars, and this is in like 2000 or something, and that was an unbelievably large amount of money. And so, we're also talking about, when we're talking about these options, we're talking about the fact that how people want to deal with landscape, how they, you're cutting through places. We're dealing with how you can deal with bridges to try to maintain regional linkages, how you can put something through a piece of parkland in such a way that you play with perspective to be able to have things joined, hiding of fences, learning from the picturesque, etc. And so this is where I call it landscape thinking, because we also had to try to think about a sense of landscape which bridged a whole lot of other things. And I remember there was a discussion that was had at one meeting I was at, which was around this thing called the 3 Ps, and we're all of the consultants, of which there was about 30 of us, standing around a table like this, looking at these big plans. And there was one town, I can't remember the name of it, and we looked at it, and we've been looking at towns all the way through. It's actually not this project, it's another project. And it was about a bypass, and we were looking at this town, and none of us could remember a single thing. We'd all been through that town, but there were so many towns, we couldn't remember a thing. But we had to make the decision right then. And so we were going through and trying to talk about this town. It's like, the macroeconomics guy said to us, we were all looking through our notes, and the economics guy said, has it got the 3 Ps? Have I told you this story before? It's a really good story. And I was like, what do you mean, the 3 Ps? And he said, can you get petrol? Can you buy a pie? Can you take a piss? And if you can do those 3 things, it gets an off-ramp. And if you can't, it doesn't. And if it doesn't, that's the end of that town. It's done. It's finished. Over. And so you're making those kind of decisions on a piece of paper like this, and it was. I mean, I don't remember whether the place did or didn't get an off ramp, but it was such an example of the kind of weirdness of that sort of process. Now, probably the main one that is really obviously in landscape the biggest thing at the moment is around green infrastructure, and so I think a lot of landscape people will have come across this term already, and you know, it's got to be tied to this idea of ecosystem services. And so the idea that the ecosystem provides services, you know, what are they? Provisioning, what are the ecosystem services? Regulatory. There's 4, is there 5 of them, right? Sorry? Yeah. But anyway, so what you have to recognise about this term ecosystem service is that it represents a failure of the conservation movement, because ultimately environmental economics developed in the 90s as a way for the environmental movement to deal with the fact that in the face of neoliberal reforms and in the face of growth, it was almost impossible to protect landscape and the environment. And so ecosystem services is a way of trying to give things that are effectively intangible some value of science. And so there's if you follow and look at the kind of Dawkins, Hitchens, atheist sort of thing around science, there's also a lot of people who are talking about the idea that, and I'm not necessarily a believer in this, but it is something that's happening, the idea that you can use a scientific basis to develop an ethical position. And so you can actually, in other words, the things that we might say that we get from religion around values, if you pursue science enough, you could come up with those same values, so therefore we don't need religion. That's one side of that thing. And so I think ecosystem services is part of this same thing, about providing and giving a sense of value to things which haven't had economic value. And so, this is why, for example, the carbon taxes going forward is such an important mechanism, because without carbon pricing, nobody's ever going to take seriously climate change as something that they have to deal with until they realise that there are economic impacts. Everything has to be put in those terms. And I think that both the term infrastructure and its use and the idea of ecosystem services are like that. And so one of the projects that is the oldest project probably that people talk about in relationship to this idea of landscape as infrastructure is the Back Bay Fens by Olmsted and Vaux. And it's a real prototypical green infrastructure project. And so it's, for one thing, what are the 3 characteristics that the article I talked about, or I recommended that you guys read on green infrastructure? What were they? Economic, green. So, yeah? Yep. Green. Connectivity, right? Sorry? And there's a split. And what's the split in that they talk about in that article? It's a split, the social versus the environmental, basically. And so what's been happening is that increasingly people have been using landscape and green infrastructure as a rationale for the economic and for the socio-economic, and whereas the environmental performance of the systems are often very suspect. And so this is where there's a confluence between, or a convergence between, the ecological and the social. And that, of course, is what all of Olmsted's work was about. This idea of the lungs of the city, that open spaces are healthy, those were things that allowed landscape to gain value. And this project comprises a series of interconnected parks that work along a water body, basically, which is the Fens. And so Franklin Park is one of them. There's the I think it's an arboretum over here. and then you can work your way down here. And so what's really interesting about this part of Boston is that, Boston's a pretty interesting place anyway, but that, this system was really doing things, and particularly in the Fens, or the Back Bay Fens, it was really creating water-sensitive urban design well before we had such a conception. So in the 19th century, when the landscape, looked like this, what was happening was that the tidal movement meant that there was basically sewer was running into this water body, and tidal movement meant that that material was washed into the sea. And so it was effectively using the tidal movement as a way of running a sewage system. So while that was not sustainable in the densities, et cetera, nonetheless, it was a recognition that landscape was a process and a system, and it was trying to ornamentalize it. And part of that is because if you think about, this is the sort of the aesthetic of it. It's a classic picturesque or English landscape style landscape. And this is where there's an interesting and odd sort of thing where English landscape, because as a landscape type, it didn't have such strong edges, because it was sort of naturalistic, because it allowed for regeneration, all of those things. So as much as it was about an image of landscape, as much as it was about a kind of image of the natural, which was fake, because it's like, all these species mostly are not indigenous, nonetheless, maintaining that sense of nature allowed it to maintain its ecological performance. And so even though it's a simulation of ecology or a simulation of nature, it was ecological. One of the problems we face now are that, in a way, that there's not this flexibility in landscape where erosion can occur, where plants can regenerate, where edges like this can move. For the system to function, it needs those kind of flexibilities built in, and the Back Bay Fens is one of those systems. And so, the other thing to note, which is I think obvious, but it might not be obvious for some of our architectural friends, is that whenever we talk about ecological systems, we have to be talking about water and catchment, really, because all, it's an obvious thing to say, but water flows downhill, and topography provides a sort of like a microclimatic edge to things. And so working between catchment and water movement are the key aspects of any system of green infrastructure. And so this is where, obviously you guys, I think the landscape guys, you're doing this thing with Tanya, and you've been talking about material flow and all of that kind of stuff. So I think it's quite important to recognise that. And a project that you've also probably, some of the landscape guys will have heard about, but I think is important, and I'll discuss it again, is this project for the East London Green Grid. And obviously, have we talked about Muff Architects and their work yet? Well, we had Jo Gibbons here last year. She talked about some of these projects. But East London Green Grid was part of the Olympic bid. And so, obviously, cities use, as we discussed for Barcelona, cities use events as catalysts. And so for that process, as part of that process, a large-scale strategic water system, a green infrastructure system for London was conceived. Now, the urgency of it was to do with the fact that there were sea level rise changes and climate change related challenges that were potentially going to face the Thames. And so the Thames barrier, storm barrier, was also one of the mechanisms that is part of this system. And if we look at it, there are, these mappings, there are a whole lot of mappings that demonstrate a range of issues. And whenever we see these sort of corridors, most of the time the corridors are always based around river corridors, almost always, because we need some sense of flexibility around those spaces. At the same time, this is where we go into the socio-economic. What you're seeing in a drawing like this is you're seeing the accessibility of open space. And so this is where one of the main convergences that's happened in planning is this idea that you should be no more than 400 metres from a piece of open space or a piece of neighbourhood open space. And so a mapping like this demonstrates where the darker areas are areas that are deficient of open space. And so this is an example of how the social and the environmental overlay each other if we consider that most open spaces that are part of a green infrastructure system are part of a river system. And then we talk about the way that they are distributed in relationship to access to open space. And what you'll discover is that those areas that are not accessible to open space have the lowest socioeconomic profile in terms of dollars or pounds, because a lot of the time the property developers, and there's a correlation between vegetation and wealth, which you only have to go to Constantia to realise. And so this is where there's a kind of interaction between the environmental and the socioeconomic. And probably one of the other things that's really interesting is also, if you're thinking about here, the Green Grid Network is planned around, bike paths and walking paths. And so there again, because water systems are continuous and linked, therefore we start to put and converge other infrastructures with those systems. So we're converging bike paths and walking paths with water systems, and in London that also meant systems for boats and barges, etc., to move along those waterways. And so we can see how, both in terms of green infrastructure, but also in terms of physical infrastructure, there is a convergence between those two things. And so, perhaps the most interesting part of the whole project for me were a series of interventions in the back of the book. So you turn over the book, and at the front of it, it's full of these examples of maps and strategic stuff, etc. But then on the back of it, there are a whole lot of responses to the green infrastructure system from artists, landscape architects, writers, etc. And so the reason that they are doing that, and I know this friend of mine, Jamie Dean, was involved with this project, was that they wanted to give a sense of tangibility to what that green infrastructure was. So it seems like it's a big instrumental idea, but what actually is green infrastructure? And so by moving their way, this particular piece by a photographer here, moving his way through one of these corridors, which revealed that sometimes it's a kind of feral drainage ditch, other times it's a common, other times it's a golf course, then it's an allotment garden, then it's a cemetery, then it's a water body. And so you realise that what are we talking about here? What we're really doing is we're rebranding our existing open spaces as green infrastructure and just thinking about them in terms of connection. Not much actually changes to them. And I mean, this is a kind of interesting thing, because then you think, is green infrastructure bullshit? Like, what is actually happening? Nothing is really happening. It's just a reclassification of space. Now, once it's important, because if you can recognise that this space is linked into a system that's involved in something as instrumental as climate change mitigation, maybe that's a way of saving SpaceX from being built over or eaten up by other infrastructure, because we're recognising its role. So it's somewhat rhetorical in terms of what it does. But at the same time, they were intervening in these, and they produced a series of these sort of nice projects, which were just about, this is just a series of they built a whole lot of these little pieces of concrete, and they would spread them through this landscape to make seating areas or an odd bench, or to at other points they would wall them off to make a soccer pitch. And so it's a kind of a module that opens up the open space. Similarly, at other points where there were spaces that were unused, they were building in cultural facilities into those corridors. They're also doing things around rail corridors, trying to bring rail corridors in, because rail corridors are also really important in terms of biodiversity. We think about the fact that how, in a ecological sense, the plants and fauna and flora, how they move, other than the waterway, probably the most continuous thing is a railway corridor, because species can move up and down a railway corridor. There can be distances between plants, and so the role of railway corridors as corridors within a kind of patch matrix corridor sort of system is really important. So I think if we go through these different models, I think what you're seeing, if I look at them now, and this is roughly in a kind of date order as well, is we're moving from an idea of something that is kind of looks infrastructural, and to the idea of and something that's about the role of landscape in relationship to infrastructure, to the idea of infrastructure as a space, to the idea of infrastructural thinking, and to finally the model of green infrastructure, which has ultimately probably been given landscape architecture one of its greatest sort of powers in terms of its ability to value or to be valued for its contribution to the city.